There are days when the sky over the Carolinas does something it was never supposed to do. March 28, 1984 was one of those days. It began quietly. The night before, a strong area of low pressure was drifting east out of the Mississippi Valley. By the following afternoon, as it crossed into Georgia, the pressure at its center near Athens fell to 976 millibars. That is the reading you would expect from a Category 2 hurricane pushing toward shore. But this was not a hurricane. It was a spring storm system, and it was dragging two completely different worlds behind it. Northwest of the front, the morning had been cold. Temperatures sat in the 20s and 30s. Southeast of it, warm air was pouring up from the Gulf. By early afternoon, thermometers in eastern North Carolina and South Carolina had climbed into the 70s, and in places into the low 80s. Between those two air masses ran a boundary, and along that boundary, the atmosphere was loading itself like a spring. Forecasters saw it coming. On the morning of March 28th, the Severe Local Storms Unit, the forecasting office that would later become the Storm Prediction Center, placed the Carolinas under a high risk of severe weather. It was the highest of the 5 threat levels they had, and it was the first time that designation had ever been issued for the region. The problem was what they had to see it with. In 1984, the National Weather Service was still using radar equipment built on technology dating back to the Second World War. That radar could show you where rain was falling. It could not show you the rotation hiding inside a thunderstorm. Doppler radar would not begin arriving until 1988. That evening, forecasters were reading a violent night through equipment that could only show them half the picture. The first severe storms fired around 2:30 in the afternoon over northern Georgia. By 5 o'clock, the first violent tornado of the day, an F4, was on the ground just north of Columbia, South Carolina. In Newberry, a tornado tore apart buildings along Main Street, including a dance academy where students survived by pressing themselves under a staircase. At 25 minutes past 6, a pair of F4 tornadoes crossed the state line into Scotland County, North Carolina. One lifted after 3 miles. The other kept going for another 35, straight through Maxton and Red Springs, with a damage path that reached 2.5 miles across. Dr. Theodore Fujita, the scientist whose name is on the tornado scale itself, came to survey the wreckage. He found that essentially every substantial building in Red Springs had been damaged. At 6:44, an F3 touched down in northern Bladen County and stayed on the ground for 40 miles. Cutting through Beaver Dam and Salemburg. 12 people died along that single track. In Roseboro, one survivor said afterward that it felt like a lifetime, but it was really only a minute or two. The tornado had been moving at almost 60 miles an hour. By 7:15, another F4 was down north of Clinton, running 21 miles through Faison, Calypso, and Mount Olive. Just after 7:30, a tornado ripped through LaGrange in Lenoir County and injured 81 people. Minutes later, the deadliest tornado of the entire outbreak formed and traveled 28 miles into Pitt County. It struck Greenville, Winterville, Ayden, and Snow Hill. It damaged the campus of East Carolina University. It killed 16 people and injured more than 150. And still, it was not over. 6 more tornadoes formed across northeastern North Carolina, between Rocky Mount and the Great Dismal Swamp. On any other night, each of them would have been the headline. By 10:30, the line finally weakened along the coast. 7 hours had passed since the first touchdown. The final count was 24 tornadoes, 11 in North Carolina, 11 in South Carolina, 2 in Georgia. 7 of them rated F4. 57 people were dead. 42 in North Carolina, and 15 in South Carolina. 1,248 were injured. Property damage came to at least $578 million. One statistic tells you almost everything about who died that night. 37% of the fatalities occurred in mobile homes. The storms had been moving as fast as 65 miles an hour, crossing the whole of eastern North Carolina in about 4 hours. In a lightweight home, at that speed, in the dark, there was very little anyone could do. Governor Jim Hunt called it the worst natural disaster North Carolina had seen in 100 years. What followed changed how this country watches the sky. 4 years later, the government began installing the NEXRAD Doppler radar network, the system that finally let forecasters see rotation forming inside a storm before it reached the ground. Warning lead times, once measured in seconds, began to be measured in minutes. No-way weather radio coverage was pushed out across rural counties that had been effectively deaf that night. Volunteer storm spotter networks were rebuilt and expanded. States tightened anchoring requirements for manufactured homes, and communities began building the public shelters that had not existed in 1984. None of it brought back the 57. But the lesson those 7 hours taught has never expired. If you wait for the warning to start getting ready, you have already waited too long. Some disasters announce themselves. This one started with a machine that nobody was watching. The Wilberg Mine sat in Emery County, Utah, about 115 miles southeast of Salt Lake City, tunneled into the Wasatch Plateau. It was owned by Utah Power and Light and operated by the Emery Mining Corporation, and it fed coal to the power plants that kept the lights on across the state. By 1984, it was running a longwall machine, a massive shearing system that grinds coal off a wall hundreds of feet across. On the evening of Wednesday, December 19, 1984, 6 days before Christmas, the crew in the Fifth Right longwall section was going for a record. They were attempting the highest 24-hour coal production ever achieved on a longwall in the United States. Because of that, the section was crowded. Normally, around a dozen people would be working there. That night, there were 28. 18 were miners. 9 were company officials who had come underground specifically to watch history being made, including the mine manager, the general mine foreman, and a vice president of operations. About 5,000 feet inside the mountain, near the mouth of that section, sat an air compressor. It had 2 safety cutoff devices. Both had been bypassed. The machine had been switched on, apparently by accident, and then left running unattended for 69 hours. Nobody shut it off. Nobody checked it. At roughly 9 o'clock that night, it caught fire. The flames took hold in an area that had never been fireproofed, and there were no fire suppression devices on the equipment. Smoke and poisonous gas poured into the tunnels. The fire was in the intake, the passage carrying fresh air to the crew, which meant it was sitting directly across the only path those 28 people had to get out. Behind it, another 3,000 feet deeper into the mountain, the crew was still working. One man got out. Kenneth Blake, a maintenance foreman, had been called back to work a second shift that night. He noticed the belt had stopped, then noticed smoke. Minutes later came the phone call telling them to evacuate. Blake felt his way through a tunnel choked with smoke, found a small door, and made it to the surface. Emery County Sheriff Lamar Guyman, who saw him come out, later said his survival was nothing short of a miracle. The other 27 never reached the door, 26 men and 1 woman. What followed was 3 days of desperate effort. More than 30 mine rescue teams came from Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. Miners from surrounding operations refused to go home. They slept on benches and on the floor of the bathhouse in case they were needed. The rescue was coordinated by the company's assistant safety director, Dave Larisky, a man who would one day run the Federal Mine Safety Agency himself. On the 3rd day, rescue crews finally reached the Fifth Right section and located 25 bodies. Before they could bring anyone out, the fire flared back to life. The teams were forced to retreat, and the decision was made to seal the mine to starve the fire of oxygen. That is the part of this story that people in Emery County still cannot talk about easily. The families knew where their husbands and sons and daughter were. They knew the bodies had been found. And then the mountain was closed, with the dead still inside. And it stayed closed. Recovery was not completed until December of 1985, nearly a full year later. The section where the fire began was not reopened until July of 1986. Small towns like Orangeville, Huntington, and Price lost 4 and 5 men each. Some families waited 12 months to hold a funeral. The investigations took years, and they were brutal. In the spring of 1987, the Mine Safety and Health Administration confirmed the faulty compressor as the ignition source and issued 34 citations against the operator. 9 of those violations were found to have directly contributed to the disaster, including the failure to update the firefighting and evacuation plan after the mine switched to longwall mining in 1979, inadequate training on the emergency breathing devices called self-contained self-rescuers, and the absence of fire suppression on unattended electrical equipment. The company was fined $113,944, but the agency itself did not escape. The United Mine Workers pointed out that inspectors had been in that mine days before the fire and had written none of those citations. The union also argued that the investigators were asking the wrong question. The men did not die because there was a fire. They died because they had no way out. A return airway that could have served as an escape route had been blocked by a cave-in, and the mine had been allowed to operate anyway. Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah requested a congressional review. The General Accounting Office report, released in November of 1987, faulted the agency for permitting the mine to run with an outdated evacuation plan, with no fire suppression devices, with a compressor known to be defective, and with that escape route blocked. The reforms followed. The agency issued a directive requiring fire suppression systems on all lubricated underground air compressors and tightened the rules on unattended equipment. Training standards for self-rescuers were overhauled because investigators found devices that had gone unused and devices used incorrectly. Escapeway requirements were enforced far more strictly, and the practice of granting quiet permission to operate with a blocked airway was dragged into the open. The families sued. Utah Power and Light settled out of court for $22 million without admitting negligence. 2 monuments stand in Emery County today. Every December 19th, headlights move up the dark canyon road toward the mine, and the names are read out loud. On the southwest edge of Chicago, where Romeoville meets Lamont, the Union Oil Company of California ran one of the largest refineries in the Midwest. It employed more than 700 people and processed roughly 151,000 barrels of crude oil every day. On the evening of Monday, July 23, 1984, that refinery blew apart. The story does not start that Monday. It starts 14 years earlier. In 1970, a new pressure vessel went into service in the fluid catalytic cracking complex. It was an amine absorber, a tall steel tower whose job was to strip hydrogen sulfide out of a stream of propane and butane. It stood about 62 feet tall, 8.5 feet across, built from carbon steel plate roughly 1 inch thick. Filled and pressurized, it weighed 34 tons. Hydrogen sulfide is unforgiving to steel. In 1974, an inspection found hydrogen blisters and laminations forming in the tower's shell. The refinery cut out a section of the lower wall and welded in a replacement using hand welding. And then they skipped a step. After that kind of repair, the metal is supposed to be reheated to relieve the internal stresses the welding creates. That treatment was never performed. For the next 10 years, invisible cracks spread outward from that repair weld into steel that hydrogen had already made brittle. When investigators later examined the fragments, they found a crack roughly 2.5 feet long that had already eaten through more than 90% of the wall thickness, and they found that hydrogen had cut the steel's resistance to fracture by more than half. At about 5:30 on that Monday evening, operators got a phone call. Someone had seen a vapor cloud near the tower, maybe 15 to 20 feet long, hanging about 12 feet off the ground. A worker making a routine hourly check went to look and found a hairline crack running along a horizontal weld. They tried to save it. Crews attempted to bypass the vessel and bleed the pressure off, but the crack was already growing. It went from about 6 inches to 2 feet. The operator ordered an evacuation. Meanwhile, the plant's own fire brigade did what fire brigades do. They gathered at the scene. At roughly 8 minutes before 6, the crack raced all the way around the tower's circumference. The vessel came apart. The upper section, the better part of 34 tons of steel, launched like a missile, cleared nearby houses, and came down in a field more than 3,400 feet away. The escaping gas found an ignition source, and the refinery caught fire. 17 people were killed. 11 of them were members of the plant fire brigade, the largest number of industrial firefighters lost in a single incident in American history. 17 more were hospitalized. And it kept going. A second explosion tore through as the alkylation unit reactor let go. Fire spread to the unsaturated gas unit, a hydrotreater compressor, a warehouse, slop oil tanks, the crude unit, and the coker unit. The blast had damaged the refinery's own hydrant system, so the men fighting it were losing water pressure. The concussion knocked out a transmission tower carrying 138,000 volts, and as many as 10,000 homes went dark. Debris was thrown so high that it struck an airplane flying 1,500 feet above the plant. The fire burned at temperatures approaching 4,000 degrees. People in Lockport and Lamont came out of their houses to watch a mushroom cloud rise over the tree line. It took 35 outside fire departments and about 17 hours to put it out. The federal government took custody of pieces of the ruptured tower and sent them to the National Bureau of Standards. The findings were blunt. The steel used in the vessel was susceptible to hydrogen-induced cracking. Repair welds done in the field without stress relief were especially vulnerable. And the vessel had a long documented history of in-service defects. In other words, the refinery had been warned by its own inspection records for a decade and had kept the tower in service anyway. Damage was placed at more than $100 million. Some estimates of the full cost, including compensation, run to roughly $500 million. Then came the part that shook the entire industry. Corrosion engineers went out and surveyed similar vessels at other refineries. Of the amine absorbers they examined, around 60% showed cracking. 12 of 14 units running one type of amine were cracked, 3 of 5 running another. 16 more instances turned up in connected piping and regeneration equipment. Romeoville was not a freak accident. It was the first one to go. In 1986, federal safety officials issued a formal warning to every refinery in the country, describing the hazard and the inspection methods needed to find these cracks before they found you. Post-weld heat treatment on repairs in that service stopped being optional. Regular ultrasonic and magnetic particle inspection programs for vessels in wet hydrogen sulfide service became standard practice. Firefighting doctrine changed too. Romeoville is one of the reasons responders are now trained never to mass personnel around a leaking pressurized vessel, and to use unmanned monitors instead of putting human beings in the blast radius. Romeoville also became one of the case studies, alongside the disasters that followed it, that pushed the country toward the Federal Process Safety Management Rule of 1992, which finally required refineries to document, inspect, and manage the mechanical integrity of equipment, exactly like that tower. In 1989, the victims and their families received a settlement of nearly $30 million. 11 of the men who died had run toward the leak because their coworkers were standing near it. San Ysidro is the last neighborhood in the United States before you reach Mexico. In 1984, it was a working-class border community in the far south of San Diego, and the McDonald's on San Ysidro Boulevard was the kind of place where the whole neighborhood turned up. Families after work, kids who had ridden over on their bicycles, teenagers earning money on summer shifts. On Wednesday, July 18, 1984, that restaurant became the site of what was then the deadliest mass shooting by a single gunman in American history. The man who did it was 41 years old. He was an unemployed welder and former security guard who had moved his family out to San Ysidro from Ohio only months earlier, after losing his job and then losing the work he found afterward. What matters in this story is not his name. What matters is what happened in the 3 days before. On July 15th, he told his wife that he thought something was wrong with his mind and that he needed help. On the morning of July 17th, he picked up the phone and called the San Diego Mental Health Clinic. He asked for an appointment. He left his name and his number with the receptionist, and he was told someone would call him back within a few hours. Nobody called. According to his wife, he sat beside that telephone for hours, waiting. The receptionist had written his name down wrong. The message sat in a file under a name that did not exist. The next afternoon, a little before 4 o'clock, he walked into the McDonald's and began shooting. Inside were roughly 45 people. Alberto Leos was 16 years old and working the shift. He was shot 5 times, and he survived by pulling the laces out of his shoes and using them as tourniquets on his own legs. Wendy Flanagan was 17, raising money for a cheerleading uniform that summer. She hid in a utility room with others and never forgot the smell of the air in that space, which someone later told her was the smell of fear. The first officer on the scene was Miguel Rosario, a Marine Corps veteran on patrol. He had been sent to what dispatchers believed was a single accidental shooting. The initial calls had gone out with the wrong location, and it took about 10 minutes before officers reached the right building. Rosario arrived carrying a standard-issue 6-shot revolver, and the gunman opened fire on his patrol car. Then came the part that this country has argued about ever since. Police sealed off 6 blocks. They set up a command post, and then, following the doctrine of the era, they waited. In 1984, the accepted practice was containment. Patrol officers surrounded a scene and held it until a specialized tactical team could arrive and take control. That team's commander was caught in rush-hour traffic getting there. Officers standing outside could hear what was happening inside and had no authorization to go in. It ended at 17 minutes past 5, when a police marksman on the roof of the post office across the street fired a single shot. 77 minutes had passed. 21 people were dead. 19 more were wounded. The youngest victim was 8 months old. The oldest was 74. Among the dead were grandmothers, McDonald's employees still in uniform, and 3 boys who had ridden their bicycles over that afternoon and were killed outside in the parking lot. Survivors, like Alberto Leos, have said the thing they cannot get past is not the shooting itself, it is the waiting. Knowing that people who were still alive when the shooting started bled to death while help stood outside. The restaurant never reopened. In September of 1984, the building was demolished, and the corporation donated the land to the city. Today, the site holds a satellite campus of Southwestern College. A memorial of 21 hexagonal pillars stands there, one for each person killed, and in July of 2021, on the 37th anniversary, a new memorial was dedicated on the same ground. The changes that came out of San Ysidro were real, and they reshaped American policing. San Diego tore its tactical program down and rebuilt it. The department created a full-time, continuously training special response unit, and it upgraded the weapons and equipment available to officers, several of whom had said openly that they felt helpless that day with a service revolver. Departments in other cities came to San Diego to learn how it was done, and dedicated tactical teams spread across the country. Over the following decades, the equipment that had once been locked away for specialists, rifles with optics, body armor, helmets, moved into the hands of ordinary patrol officers. The department also did something almost unheard of at the time. It formally debriefed every officer involved and offered professional counseling to anyone who needed it. Before 1984, that simply was not done. Today, it is standard practice across the country. And the doctrine itself eventually broke. Contain and wait, the policy that governed those 77 minutes, would survive another 15 years before Columbine finally destroyed it. The rule that replaced it is the one taught in every academy now. The first officers on scene go in. They do not wait for the team. They move toward the sound, because every second counts against them. The other lesson is quieter, and America has been much slower to learn it. 3 days before he walked into that restaurant, A man told his wife he was sick, and then asked a clinic for help. The system spelled his name wrong and lost him. 21 people paid for that clerical error with their lives. Tulsa, Oklahoma sits where the prairie meets a network of small creeks with unglamorous names: Mingo, Joe, Hikey, Dirty Butter. On a normal day, you could step across some of them. On the night of Memorial Day weekend, 1984, they killed 14 people. The rain began late on Saturday evening, May 26th. A cold front pushing down from the north simply stopped moving over the Tulsa metropolitan area. When a front stalls, the storms that form along it do not pass through. They train over the same ground, one after another, for hours. Between about 8:30 that Saturday night and 4:30 on Sunday morning, May 27th, the sky emptied over the city. Officially, Tulsa recorded 9 1/3 inches of rain. Unofficially, parts of town measured more than 14. Every square foot of the Mingo Creek Basin took at least 9 inches. At the peak of the storm, the Brookside neighborhood received 2 inches of rain in 15 minutes. The creeks came up in the dark while the city was asleep. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Ann Patton, then an aide to the Public Works Commissioner, got a phone call telling her to come downtown immediately. She could not drive there. City dump trucks were dispatched to carry officials through the water because the Crosstown Expressway was running 3 feet deep. Reports were coming in of cars being swept off the highways. That is where most of the dead were found. Of the 14 people killed, 6 died in vehicles. Drivers came around a bend in the dark, hit water they could not see, and were carried away. Firefighters spent that Sunday wading into Dirty Butter Creek to search half-submerged cars while 200 neighbors stood on the Peoria Avenue Bridge and watched. Among the dead was a 13-year-old boy who was electrocuted in his own bathroom when floodwater energized the pipes in his house. 288 people were injured. At the Holiday Mobile Home Park, a Life Flight helicopter crew, a nurse named Linda Fields, and a pilot named Don Nepareni spent the morning lifting people directly off the roofs of their homes. They pulled out 40 people and at least 4 dogs before the day was over. 20 years later, Fields would meet one of the women she had hoisted off a roof, and neither of them had forgotten. By the time the water went down, more than 5,500 buildings had been damaged or destroyed, including more than 20 schools. 7,000 vehicles were wrecked. 3,500 families were out of their homes. The damage came to $180 million, and nearly 70% of that total came from a single waterway, Mingo Creek. President Reagan issued a major disaster declaration. Here is the part that should have been unbearable. Tulsa had seen this before. A flood in 1923 left 4,000 people homeless. There were floods in 1970, in 1974, and on Memorial Day weekend in 1976. The city had joined the federal flood insurance program, adopted floodplain rules, and kept issuing building permits in the bottoms anyway. 9 damaging floods had hit in roughly 15 years. 14 people died in 1984 because a city that knew exactly what its creeks could do had kept letting people live in their path. What happened next is the reason Tulsa is now studied by engineers around the world. The mayor, Terry Young, had been in office for 19 days. Before daylight on that Sunday morning, he and the street commissioner assembled the city's first flood hazard mitigation team. They did not wait for the water to recede to start planning. Experts mapped the extent of the flooding, and within 2 weeks, the team had identified target buyout areas. In June, city officials were already sitting down with the Federal Emergency Management Agency to discuss paying for it. Then Tulsa did the thing almost no American city was willing to do. Instead of rebuilding in the floodplain, it bought the floodplain and emptied it. The city purchased about 300 homes in the worst-hit areas, scaled back from an original proposal of 535. 2 years later, it bought the entire Holiday Mobile Home Park. Over the following decades, the voluntary acquisition program grew until more than 900 homes and businesses had been removed from harm's way, and more than 500 families relocated. That land became greenways, detention basins, ball fields, and parks. Not one of those families has flooded since. Tulsa also created a stormwater utility, one of the first in the country, funded by a fee tied to hard surfaces, the driveways and parking lots that push rainwater into creeks instead of into the ground. Voters approved $120 million in sales tax and bond money, and the city secured more than $80 million in federal funds. The Mingo Creek project alone ran to roughly $140 million and included 10 miles of engineered channel and 23 retention sites, the last of which took decades to finish. The results speak. A city that once flooded almost annually built a system designed for the 100-year storm, and Tulsa residents came to enjoy some of the lowest flood insurance rates in the nation because of how thoroughly the city reformed itself. In 2004, the detention area between 94th East Avenue and Mingo Creek was named the Ann Patton Commons, after the woman who spent 20 years fighting for it. She has said the honest thing about all of it, which is that Tulsa sits in country prone to freak storms, and sooner or later, it will happen again. The difference is that this time, the water will find parks where the houses used to be. In 1949, a man named John Van Arsdale started an airline in Provincetown, Massachusetts, to fly people across Cape Cod Bay to Boston. He named it Provincetown Boston Airlines. For 35 years, it was a family business, and it was the kind of small, careful operation that New Englanders trusted. By 1984, it had become something else entirely. Airline deregulation had opened the map, and PBA expanded hard to keep from being swallowed. It was flying about 4,000 passengers a day into 35 cities across the Northeast and the Southeast, with a fleet of more than 100 aircraft, 1,500 employees, and 300 pilots. It was the largest commuter airline in the United States. Then came the fall of 1984. On September 7th, a PBA plane leaving Naples, Florida, crashed after being loaded with the wrong type of fuel. One person was killed, and 5 were hurt. That accident brought federal inspectors down on the company, and what they found was not a single mistake. Investigators came away with falsified maintenance records and with sworn statements from the airline's own pilots backing them up. On November 9th, 5 of the airline's top managers resigned. On November 10th, the Federal Aviation Administration issued an emergency order of revocation. The charges were improper aircraft maintenance and the use of unqualified pilots. The nation's largest commuter airline was grounded, and its operating certificate was pulled. That is the most severe penalty the government can impose on a carrier. For 2 weeks, inspectors went through the company. They recertified aircraft one by one. They retested pilots. They supervised the rewriting of the airline's safety manuals from scratch. Limited flying resumed around November 25th. On Tuesday, December 4th, PBA returned to full service under a brand new certificate. 2 days later, on Thursday, December 6, 1984, Flight 1039 sat at Jacksonville International Airport, bound for Tampa. It was the 4th trip that crew had made on that route that day. The aircraft was a Brazilian-built Embraer Bandeirante, a 19-seat twin turboprop the company had bought in October of 1981. On board were 11 passengers and 2 crew members. The captain was 34 years old and had been with the airline since 1974. At 12 minutes past 6 in the evening, they were cleared for takeoff. 1 minute later, climbing through 600 feet over the departure end of the runway, the crew acknowledged a routine radio frequency change. Everything was normal. That was the last transmission. About 30 seconds later, people on the ground watched the airplane fall out of the sky. Something went wrong with the pitch control, the system that lets a pilot hold the nose where he wants it. The crew fought it. In fighting it, the load on the tail exceeded what the structure could take. The elevators, the horizontal stabilizer, the tail cone, and part of the underside fin tore away from the aircraft while it was still flying. The stabilizer came down in one piece, roughly 1,100 feet short of where the rest of the airplane landed. At 14 minutes past 6, the Banderantes struck a swamp of scrub pine about 7,800 feet beyond the end of the runway, disintegrated and burned. All 13 people aboard died instantly. The impact forces were so far beyond human tolerance that investigators later wrote that survival had never been possible. The wreckage was scattered across boggy woods in the dark. Recovery crews waded in the next morning to bring the bodies out. The National Transportation Safety Board issued its final report on June 24, 1986. The probable cause was a malfunction of either the elevator control system or the elevator trim system, producing a pitch control problem the crew tried to correct, which overstressed a control rod and then the tail attachment structure itself. And then the board wrote the sentence that has haunted this case ever since. It could not determine what the precise problem was. After 18 months of investigation, the exact failure that started the chain was never identified. Public confidence collapsed. Bookings fell by roughly 75% almost overnight. The family tried to save the company by selling a stake to the owner of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It was not enough. PBA filed for bankruptcy protection, was absorbed by another carrier, and on September 6, 1988, its federal operating certificate was formally retired. The airline that a Cape Cod family had built over 35 years did not survive the crash. The reforms mattered. 1984 became the year the FAA stopped treating small carriers gently. In a single month, the agency grounded 3 airlines. Starting that year, the Department of Transportation began rebuilding an inspector workforce that had been allowed to shrink, adding nearly 700 inspectors in 2 years. The Safety Board recommended tightening standards for commuter operators specifically, including more pilot training, more frequent testing, and better cockpit equipment. But the deepest problem took another decade to fix. In 1984, commuter airlines flew under a lighter set of federal rules than the major carriers, even though the passenger boarding at the gate had no way of knowing that. It took a string of commuter crashes through the early 90s before the FAA finally issued what became known as the One Level of Safety Rule in 1995, requiring scheduled commuter airliners to meet the same standards as the big jets. 13 people boarded a 19-seat airplane in Jacksonville 48 hours after the government had cleared the airline to fly again. They had every reason to believe that clearance meant something. Barneveld, Wisconsin, sits in Iowa County, about 25 miles west of Madison, in the rolling, unglaciated hills of the southwest corner of the state. In the spring of 1984, it had roughly 580 residents, 1 main street, 18 businesses and public buildings, and a Lutheran church with a bell tower. It was the kind of town where everyone knew whose truck was parked where. At 41 minutes past midnight on Friday, June 8, 1984, it ceased to exist. The setup had been building all day. A low-pressure system moved into the Midwest on June 7th and pulled a surge of hot, humid Gulf air north with it. Across the region, from North Dakota down to Kansas, storms fired through the afternoon and evening. Before the outbreak was over, 46 tornadoes would touch down across the Midwest, killing 13 people and injuring more than 300. But the part that came for Wisconsin arrived in the dark, and that is what made it different. Violent tornadoes almost never happen in the middle of the night. The great majority of tornadoes in this country occur between 3 in the afternoon and 9 in the evening, when the ground has heated all day. A supercell producing the strongest tornado on the scale at 40 minutes past midnight is a statistical outlier. Nobody in Barneveld went to bed expecting it. There was a tornado watch in effect. A watch means conditions are favorable. It had been posted for hours, and hours of nothing had passed. Most of the town was asleep. The other problem was the radar. In 1984, forecasters looked for a signature shape on their screens. A hook curling off the edge of a storm, which usually indicates rotation. The Barneveld storm never produced a clear hook. Meteorologists could see fast-moving thunderstorms tracking northeast through Grant and Lafayette counties, and they could see enormous lightning. But the equipment of the day could not show them what was turning inside that cloud. The chief meteorologist at the Madison television station later described waking up that night and seeing the sky flickering constantly, like a strobe light, and knowing that was not normal. The first tornado touched down just south of Belmont in Lafayette County around midnight. The next one formed just outside Barneveld's village limits, minutes away from the houses. Then came the detail that people in that town have never gotten over. A few minutes before the tornado arrived, the power went out. Barneveld had a tornado siren. That siren ran on village power. It never sounded. Not once. The only people who had any warning at all were the handful still awake with a television on, watching a warning crawl across the bottom of the screen. The tornado that hit the village was rated F5, the highest category on the scale. It was about 450 yards wide, with estimated winds above 300 miles an hour, and it stayed on the ground for 13 miles. Investigators rated it F5 specifically because of what it did to relatively new, well-built homes. It did not damage them. It removed them. 90% of Barneveld was destroyed. 93 homes were flattened and 64 more damaged. 17 of the village's 18 businesses and public buildings were gone. Every tree along the path was taken down. 9 people were killed and roughly 200 were injured in a town of fewer than 600. And the night was not finished. The same cluster of storms kept producing. A tornado hit DeForest at 15 minutes past 1. Another struck Arlington at 25 past. Markesan was hit at 41 minutes past 1. Columbus at 49 minutes past, and Beaver Dam at 17 minutes past 2 in the morning. Nearly every tornado that came through southern Wisconsin that night was strong or violent. When the sun came up over Barneveld, rescue workers walking the second sweep of the village were looking at bare foundations and a debris field. The Lutheran church bell tower was still standing. Almost nothing else was. What happened afterward is worth telling. The village voted to rebuild in place. Help came from everywhere, including from a town called Barneveld in New York State, whose residents formed a committee, held a fundraising day that September, and mailed the proceeds to Wisconsin that November, with a request that some of it go toward playground equipment. A meteorology professor at the University of Wisconsin and his students launched a landmark study of where the debris had landed, placing newspaper ads and running a mail and phone campaign to map how far the tornado had thrown people's belongings. Barneveld became a case study in how these storms actually work. The safety changes came from the failure, not from the storm. The dead siren became a national lesson. Communities across the country began requiring battery backup power for outdoor warning sirens, because a warning system that depends on the same power lines the storm knocks down is not a warning system at all. Emergency managers pushed hard on the idea that outdoor sirens were never designed to wake people up inside their houses in the first place, and the tone alert weather radio, which switches itself on when a warning is issued and does not care whether the power is out, became the standard recommendation for every bedroom in tornado country. And the radar problem was solved by machine. Beginning in 1988, the country installed the Doppler radar network, which does not need a hook to tell you a tornado is coming. It measures the wind itself and sees the rotation directly, at night, inside the cloud, where no human eye could look. On June 8, 1984, the Dalles, Oregon, is a town on the Columbia River, about 80 miles east of Portland. In 1984, it had roughly 10,000 residents and served as the seat of Wasco County. In the fall of that year, it became the target of the largest bioterrorist attack ever carried out on American soil. And for more than a year, nobody outside a small circle knew it had happened. The story begins in 1981. When followers of the Indian guru Bhagwan Sri Rajneeshee bought a sprawling ranch of some 64,000 acres in the high desert of Wasco County and began building a city on it. They called it Rajneeshee. Thousands of red-clad followers arrived. They built roads, an airstrip, a dam, a shopping mall. They also collided immediately with their neighbors. Oregon land use law did not permit a city on farm and ranch land, and county officials refused the permits the commune needed. In 1982, the group moved enough followers into the tiny nearby town of Antelope to take over its government outright. The dispute escalated from there into a running war of lawsuits, and by 1984, the commune's leadership had concluded that the only permanent solution was to take control of Wasco County itself. 2 of the 3 county commission seats were up for election on November 6, 1984. Rajneeshee had the people to win, but not the registered voters. So the commune's leadership, headed by the guru's personal secretary, Ma Anand Sheela, pursued 2 strategies at once. One was a program that bussed homeless people from cities across the country onto the ranch and attempted to register them locally. The other was simpler and far darker. If enough voters in the Dalles were too sick to reach the polls, the math would change. In late August of 1984, 2 Wasco County commissioners visited Rajneeshee. They were given glasses of water. Both became seriously ill afterward, and one was hospitalized. That was the test. The main attack came the following month. Between roughly September 19th and October 10th, members of the commune deliberately contaminated the open salad bars at 10 restaurants in the Dalles with a bacterial pathogen. They walked in like ordinary customers and walked out again. 751 people fell sick. At least 45 were hospitalized. The victims were people eating lunch at a hotel restaurant, families out for dinner, ordinary residents of a small Oregon town. There were no deaths, which is the only mercy in this story, though people were hospitalized with severe illness and some suffered lasting effects. The outbreak was so large it strained the local hospital. Here is where the tragedy compounds. Investigators from the Oregon State Health Authority and from the Centers for Disease Control went to work, and they did competent, thorough epidemiology. They traced the cases to the restaurants. They tested the water supply and found nothing. They identified an unusual strain. And then, some 2 months later, they published the conclusion that the outbreak had most likely resulted from poor hygiene and cross-contamination by restaurant workers. The people of the Dalles were told that their neighbors, the cooks and servers in 10 local businesses, had made them sick through carelessness. Those restaurants took the blame. Some of them never recovered. The truth was that investigators in 1984 simply did not carry deliberate contamination near the top of their list of hypotheses, because in the United States, it had never happened before. Local police were suspicious from the start. So was Congressman Jim Weaver, who stood on the floor of the House of Representatives on February 28, 1985, and argued that the town had been poisoned on purpose. He was largely dismissed. Confirmation came only when the commune destroyed itself. Through 1985, the organization fractured under the weight of its own criminality. Sheela and a group of associates fled to Europe in September. The following month, the guru publicly accused her of a list of crimes and invited law enforcement onto the ranch. Investigators found a laboratory. Inside it was an open vial of the same bacterium, and testing showed that strain was indistinguishable from the one that had swept the Dalles a year earlier. The wider investigation uncovered an operation that went far beyond the salad bars. Wiretapping of the commune's own members, immigration fraud, an assassination plot against the United States Attorney for Oregon, attempted poisonings of local officials. Sheela and a co-defendant pleaded guilty in 1986. She received a 20-year sentence and served about 29 months before being released and leaving the country. The guru pleaded guilty to immigration fraud, was fined, and was deported. Rajneeshee collapsed. The reforms that followed took years, and they were substantial. The federal government did not formally acknowledge the episode as a biological weapons attack until 1997, when the full epidemiological account was finally published in a major medical journal. That paper changed practice. Public health investigators are now explicitly trained to consider intentional contamination as a possible explanation for an outbreak, and to recognize the warning signs: an unusual strain, multiple simultaneous sites with no shared supplier, a pattern that does not fit ordinary food handling. The regulatory hole was closed too. The commune had obtained its bacterial culture through entirely legal commercial channels, because in 1984, almost anyone could order dangerous pathogens with little scrutiny. Federal legislation in 1996 created the Select Agent Program, which for the first time controlled who may transfer and possess the most dangerous biological agents. After the anthrax letters of 2001, those controls were tightened again, and the nation built the detection systems it had lacked. Molecular fingerprinting networks now let laboratories across the country compare bacterial strains within days rather than months. In 1984, 751 people were poisoned in an American town, and the country needed a year to notice. For 30 years, the southeastern coast of North Carolina had been lucky, and it had forgotten what luck was. The last serious hurricane to hit that stretch of shoreline was Hazel in 1954. In the 3 decades that followed, the barrier islands south of Wilmington filled up. Beach cottages became subdivisions. Brunswick County and New Hanover County grew. An entire generation moved onto that coast having never experienced a hurricane, and the buildings they moved into had gone up under codes written for a place where nothing much happened. In September of 1984, something came for them. It began as a low-pressure area along a stalled front near the Bahamas on September 7th. The next day, it became a tropical storm and was named Diana, about 200 miles east of Cape Canaveral, Florida. At first, it drifted west and came within about 50 miles of the Florida coast, close enough that Florida was the expected target. Then it turned north instead and ran up the coastline riding over the Gulf Stream, which is some of the warmest water in the Atlantic. By September 10th, it was a hurricane, and then it did something forecasters at the time had a very hard time handling. It intensified explosively. On the evening of September 11th, Diana was a Category 4 hurricane, the second highest classification there is, with sustained winds around 130 miles an hour. It was sitting roughly 20 miles off Cape Fear. A storm of that strength making landfall on that developed, unprepared coastline would have been a catastrophe on the order of anything in the state's history. Then it stopped. A ridge of high pressure rebuilt to the north, while an upper-level disturbance passed by, and the steering currents that had been carrying Diana simply let go of it. For about 24 hours on September 12th, the hurricane sat about 50 miles east of Cape Fear and traced a slow clockwise loop in the ocean. It went nowhere. That loop is the reason people are alive today. As the storm crawled in circles, it kept pulling in cool, stable air produced by the steady rain already falling across eastern North Carolina, and that air choked it. Over the course of that day, Diana fell from Category 4 to Category 2. It also created chaos on land. Warnings had to be shifted repeatedly up and down the coast as the storm wandered. People evacuated, waited, and then watched a hurricane hold still offshore for a full day. Many of them went home. When Diana finally turned west and came in, hundreds of coastal residents who had returned to their houses were trapped by flooded roads. The eye came ashore near Bald Head Island, just north of Cape Fear and south of Wilmington, at about 1:30 in the morning on Thursday, September 13th. It was roughly 20 miles across. Maximum sustained winds were near 90 miles an hour, with a central pressure around 979 millibars, and gusts of up to 115 miles an hour were measured on land. The mayor of Long Beach, standing in his own town hall as the windows blew out, said his town was at the mercy of nature. There was one more piece of luck. Diana came ashore near low tide, which held the storm surge well below what it would otherwise have been. But the storm would not leave. It took about 12 hours to clear the coast, then wandered inland across the state for another day and a half. Wilmington measured nearly 14 inches of rain, the largest storm total ever recorded there up to that point, and the flooding that followed was fresh water rather than seawater. Roofs came off. Oak trees that had stood for a century snapped. Cars were pushed off roads. Power was out across the region. Damage across the United States came to $65.5 million. 3 people died, and all 3 deaths were indirect. 1 man had a heart attack while securing his beach house. 2 others were killed in automobile accidents. Diana then moved back out to sea, briefly re-strengthened, and became an extratropical storm near Nova Scotia on September 16th. The tragedy of Diana is not in the death toll. It is in how close the number came to being enormous, and how much of that came down to 2 accidents of timing. A wobble in the steering pattern that let dry air kill the storm. A tide table that put landfall at the low point of the cycle. Neither of those had anything to do with anything the people on that coast had done. What came out of it was a hard reassessment. Diana became a case study in what emergency managers now call evacuation fatigue. A storm that stalls offshore for a day exhausts the public's willingness to stay away from home, and the second evacuation order is always obeyed less than the first. Coastal states rebuilt their planning around that reality, moving away from decisions based on where a storm is at a given moment and toward decisions based on clearance time, the number of hours it actually takes to empty a barrier island, counted backward from the arrival of tropical storm force winds. North Carolina and the Army Corps of Engineers conducted formal hurricane evacuation studies for the coastal counties, mapping zones and routes and the real capacity of the bridges. The forecasting problem was attacked too. Diana's rapid intensification and its erratic loop had exposed how limited the observational tools of 1984 really were. The investment that followed produced better reconnaissance, better satellite interpretation, the Doppler radar network deployed from 1988 onward, and eventually the computer models that make a track forecast today several times more accurate than anything available that September. Coastal building standards were tightened as well, and North Carolina began enforcing setback and construction rules on the oceanfront with a seriousness the state had not shown during the quiet decades. The lessons were learned, but not all at once and not cheaply. Hugo came in 1989, Fran came in 1996, Floyd came in 1999, Diana was the warning shot, and the coast was fortunate that it was only a warning. At 15 minutes past 1 on the afternoon of Tuesday, April 24, 1984, the Calaveras Fault broke in Halls Valley in the Diablo Range east of San Jose, California. It was a magnitude 6.2. On the scale that measures these things, that is a moderate earthquake. It killed nobody. Somewhere between 21 and 27 people were hurt, all of them treated for cuts and bruises. Property damage came to somewhere between $7.5 and $8 million. And yet, seismologists and structural engineers still talk about that Tuesday afternoon because of one number that came off an instrument at a dam southeast of the epicenter. That number changed how this country thinks about building near a fault. Here is what happened. The rupture began about 6 miles underground, near Mount Hamilton, roughly 10 miles northeast of San Jose. It did not spread evenly in all directions. It ran southeast, tearing along about 16 miles of the fault, and a second burst of energy released near the far end of that rupture. When a fault unzips in one direction, it does something a great deal like a sonic boom. The waves it generates pile up ahead of the advancing rupture, stacking into a single violent pulse aimed at whatever lies in that direction. Engineers call it directivity, and in 1984 it was understood only in theory. What lay southeast in the path of that pulse were Morgan Hill, San Martin, Coyote, and the earth-filled dam at Coyote Lake. The accelerograph near the abutment of Coyote Lake Dam recorded a horizontal ground acceleration of about 1.29 times the force of gravity. In plain terms, for a fraction of a second, the ground at that spot was thrown sideways, harder than gravity pulls you down. At the time, it was one of the largest ground accelerations ever recorded anywhere in North America, and it came out of an earthquake that engineers would have called unremarkable. That is the part that frightened people who understood it. The building codes of the day were written around assumptions about how hard the ground could shake. A moderate earthquake had just exceeded those assumptions by a wide margin. The shaking itself was felt across roughly 46,000 square miles. Skyscrapers swayed in San Francisco. In Sacramento, curtains moved on the 16th floor of a downtown building. In Reno, Nevada, 200 miles away, people felt it, though the casinos barely paused. Closer in, the damage was real. More than 550 buildings across Santa Clara County were damaged to some degree. In Morgan Hill itself, 47 homes were damaged, chimneys came down. Mobile homes slid off their supports and store shelves emptied onto the floor. In the Jackson Oaks subdivision, at least 4 houses were knocked clean off their foundations. Downtown, the old Vota building, which had stood since 1905, was badly damaged. Several of the empty lots along Monterey Road today are where buildings stood before that afternoon. Inmates were evacuated from the Elmwood Minimum Security Jail, which took major damage. In San Jose, walls cracked, plaster fell, and a gas line broke at a sewage plant. And engineers found a crack running along the top of Anderson Dam near San Jose, a finding that would echo for decades in California's long fight over the seismic safety of its aging dams. The one genuinely good story that day came from the schools. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the children were in class. A spokeswoman for the Morgan Hill School District reported afterward that not one school had structural damage, and that the students had known exactly what to do because the district ran an earthquake drill every single month. 4 school children were among the injured, 2 of them hurt by a falling bookcase. That was the extent of it. This earthquake was almost certainly a repeat of a quake that struck the same stretch of the Calaveras in 1911. Seismologists calculated an average recurrence of roughly 160 years for an event that size on that segment. 5 years earlier, in 1979, a smaller quake had struck the same fault near Coyote Lake. The system was talking, and California was finally equipped to listen. That equipment is the story of what changed. 72 strong motion instruments across the region triggered that afternoon. Nearly 50 usable records were recovered, almost half of them from inside instrumented structures, from a single-story warehouse to a 12-story office building in San Jose. That was not luck. California had been quietly installing those instruments since the 1970s, and Morgan Hill was the event that proved the investment. The program was expanded afterward, with far more instruments placed in buildings, bridges, and dams, so that the next earthquake would teach even more. Scientists went straight back to Coyote Lake Dam. Because the recording instrument there sat near an abutment and near a ridge, they could not be certain how much of that enormous reading came from the earthquake and how much from the local terrain. So they installed a second instrument roughly 1,500 feet away to capture comparison records during aftershocks. That kind of careful, unglamorous follow-up is how the science actually advances. The Morgan Hill records became a foundational data set for the study of near-fault ground motion, and the directivity effect it demonstrated eventually worked its way into American building codes as a required consideration for structures built close to active faults. Meanwhile, California was already forcing its cities in the highest seismic zone to inventory their unreinforced masonry buildings, the brick and block structures that kill people in earthquakes. Morgan Hill had counted 12. Between what 1984 destroyed and what owners retrofitted afterward, that inventory was largely cleared out. And in 1986, the state made hazard identification and mitigation programs for those buildings a legal requirement across the seismic zone. 5 years later, on October 17, 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck the same region and killed 63 people. By then, because of what a moderate quake had taught engineers on an ordinary Tuesday in 1984, they knew a great deal more about what the ground was capable of.